Many people have problems with art and not with reality.
So why is art different?
It's pretty simple, right?
This is knowledge, this is thinking, this is thought.
Yeah, it does something strange with your head.
Welcome to the Undergang Armchair.
Bring it.
Welcome back to the Undergang Armchair. My name is Ando. And just like that, we are back again. Happy time-related holiday, my friends. I hope you had a enjoyable one, and I hope you can still count 10 fingers on your hands and, 2 eyes in your face. We are blazing into the new year with this fantastic talk with two of the folks from 68 Art Institute, based here in Copenhagen. For those who don't know, 68 is a forward-thinking, curatorial research platform. It's a space which is run by some folks who are tremendously engaged with thinking about art and thinking about how art can interact with the real world on so many different levels. So I had the pleasure of talking to Iben Elmstrom, one of the founders of 68, and Hugo Hopping, who is a active board member and an artist. And I think the result is, to be honest, truly one of the most interesting episodes we've ever done. It is on the longer side, and that is simply because we touch on so many interesting and contemporary topics, and it all just seems so relevant. So I'll leave it at that. Please enjoy my talk with Iben and Hugo. I've been very curious about what you guys do, and I'm very interested in the kind of world of these independent run spaces in Denmark. I guess I should start by asking a little bit about the history of the program. Like, where did you guys start? And I know you've also made a change recently with what you do, but when did it open and how did it open? What was the impetus for that?
Well, 68 was initiated in 2010, so it has some years already.
6 years.
Yeah, but we opened the first show in 11, but we sort of started to renovate the building in, I think, November 2010. And it was out in Amager at the place called PP43, PP43, which was a creative assembly where architects, artists, designers, musicians all shared these quite big factory buildings. It was shut down in 2014.
Let me guess, it's really nice apartments now. Or it's going to be.
They have emptied out the space, and it was sold to an international investor, even though we also tried to actually bid on it on the auction. It was sold to an investor, and first the idea was that it was going to be self-storage hotels until they could move into to build like later when the prices would probably go up more. But now there's actually a conflict over the site with the municipality out in Amager. So they have a conflict with the new owner around some I don't know the details, but some use of the land. And the council wants to buy the spot back so that they can have art or a cultural site.
That is not a story you hear very often.
No, and they said, "Oh, we have this great idea. We should, have containers and have artists come here." And we were like, Excuse you. It was not your idea, and you could have supported us when we asked for it.
Right.
But
now it's
but that's the thing. It can be a bit slow here to talk to politicians about these things.
Sure.
City development.
Well, you never know what you're missing until you lose it.
No, exactly. But we started it there, and it was really nice for us to be in such a creative environment. There was a lot of support amongst the creatives at PP43, and I think that really, in particular, helped me to form the space and form its audience also, and the program to some extent. Although I was clear from the beginning that I wanted a program for the city that made possible for Danish artists to work together with artists from abroad, because I came back from London at the time where I was studying, and felt like there was something missing in the scene.
So did you start it on your own, basically?
I started together with Christopher Sand Iversen, who is an art historian / visual cultural student. He's British, but has a Danish father like you, and has lived here for quite some years now, probably. I'm guessing now 12 years or something. So we founded it, the two of us, and Christopher is also still involved in 68 and doing editorial works and other bits.
And what did you study?
First I studied art, fine art, as an artist, as a painter, and later I studied curating. So a bit of a combination of the two.
It's a good position to come from.
I think it helps when you work with curatorial projects.
Sure, and just having some sort of understanding of production, and practice.
Praxis, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you opened it in 2010, and then when did you guys move?
We had to be out by the end of 2014 in the other building.
Okay.
So we were looking for new spaces. Quite a lot of different places in town, and a little bit by coincidence, some people that I knew had a little extra room above a bar that they were going to open in the city center called Balderdas. And then they asked us if we wanted to use the space, because they knew we were desperately looking for something. So that came about, and we opened the first show in December 2014 in the city center, in Valkendorfsgade.
And that's where you are now.
Yeah, and that's where we are now.
Well, I mean, God knows you are it's a good location. You're right there in the middle of the city. It's, it's front and center. No one can say, oh, it's so far away, I didn't make it out.
No.
Like some other spaces perhaps could say. Maybe it was like that more when you were out on Amager, the island south of the city here.
Absolutely. We did a lot to audience build in Amager. We did something called First Friday, which gathered all the galleries and
with
some of the
Mariana and Niels Borg. And okay, so were you guys around that area and northern?
Yeah.
Okay.
I initiated the project, collaborating with all these different peoples, because I felt like there was also lacking this visibility of the industrial area out there and what you could actually experience in it. So
Copenhagen has that weird thing where people are like, oh, Valby, that's so far away. And you're like, dude, it's 10 minutes by bike. It's right there. Like, if people live in London, like 45 minutes out of the city center, and it's still London,
And Amager is an amazing area because it's full of artists, either living or working there, and musicians as well. Prague's Boulevard is, I would say, one of the, maybe not right now, but was one of the most kind of dense areas for or neighborhoods for creative people.
Absolutely.
Studios, musicians, all kinds.
And I guess a lot of people would never even go out there.
Not so much anymore, because most of the spaces has closed. The ones that were publicly open in that part.
I would say also that 68 Art Space, what it was called then, when Iben was there, she also introduced this other program with Chris. It was modeled after the London one, which is First Fridays in London.
Yeah, the one we were just.
But then here it became First Tuesdays, right? I can't remember exactly.
It was the other way around. We called it First Friday, and of course, it was a program that I experienced in London, and in London it's a much bigger thing because it's a huge thing, and it involves most of the part of the East London scene, and it's actually I think it's even spreading now, and now it became, or when I left London at that time, it was already getting so popular that they had buses shipping people around, and it became almost a bit touristic for them, and a lot of more serious spaces pulled away from it. But that didn't matter for me, because the concept, it was easy to understand and easy to sort of lift and introduce here.
And that's what I mean. It was that what was great about even introducing that into that area is that it was kind of the first time in Copenhagen that you could see very clearly like the connection with Amager and Christianshavn the connection culturally between the two areas. Mm-hmm. That program really connected it and it brought into visibility very quickly, like places that really were struggling to try to get people to cross it over to Amabo Boulevard, who wanted to come over. They wanted an audience to come over. So this small little pamphlet that listed everything got people to actually move and cross Christianshavn, which was, like you were saying, Value was far away. For some reason, there was in those years, 2010, 11, and 12, it was very difficult for some people to cross over.
Right, which is literally like 5 minutes on bike. It's over a bridge and down a street, and you're there.
Yeah.
It's so close physically.
But what was really great about that also is that you could see that there's so much emphasis from planning, from the city urban planning department to try to activate areas in Copenhagen. And here comes a young curator from a Danish curator that has like an idea just purely modeled on a cultural template from London, and then made a very clear connection between the two areas without having to create any new urbanism.
Right. It's as easy as it can get, really.
Right, but it was all based on cultural interface, and the success of that is because it came in putting all these things stamped out. So getting the space downtown after we lost the space was actually sort of also coming out of this process, because we're not so far from Christianshavn, but it kind of like still put us within the area of this map.
Right, you're within the area, the pre-decided area for arts in the city.
But that's actually from this actual. If you would see the map if you will pick up these maps from that time that were being published by Iben and the cohort around it that was interested in this, you could see that 68 today falls within the circumference, which is actually very interesting, because had 68 been doing it at that time, we would have been in the center part of that map. But I don't know necessarily if the center would have wanted to actually connect with Ahmad had even not been there.
Right.
So in other words, it's kind of a theoretical question that, like, because she was an Ahmad, she was able to put the center back into the map, and this is something that was quite kind of magical in the way that people were experiencing sort of the booming of this art scene in Copenhagen.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, a lot of people started opening up because the Danish Arts Council gave, I don't know exactly when the Danish Arts Council became the Danish Arts Foundation, but in that process, maybe it was with the new government, right?
Yeah, it's sometime after we opened.
Yeah.
Because in the beginning, I remember it was called.
Yeah, exactly. I just keep on making the mistake calling councils. It's the Arts Foundation.
It's by name only, really.
Well, it's true. It's just there's a big political difference in the two concepts that I think it's accurate to call it what it is, and then you saw very clearly that all of these new spaces that open up on this new platform of funding independent artist run spaces, they all sort of started popping up also in this map.
There was a wave there,
yeah,
which was quite interesting. The fact that the state decided we're going to fund this concept, this idea, and it's true. There was just like a huge amount of spaces all of a sudden that popped up, and you guys were part of that, right? It was around the same time, and now we're seeing that they're almost all closing. But we'll get to that a little bit later. But yeah, I mean, I think it is. But at the same time, I think like it's interesting that the First Fridays concept didn't really take off. I mean, that's such a huge thing in London. It's also a big thing in San Francisco has a version of it. That's the kind of one I know. There is, I'm sure LA has one too.
Absolutely. Yeah, they have the art walk in downtown and stuff. I was just focusing on this part because I don't even know if we've collected those maps that we published. If we
I have some.
It's just if you just saw them as documents of like, you know, I've talked to urban planners in Copenhagen. They've told me from the city. They told me that right around I think it was 2012 or 2013. 1,000 people started arriving to Copenhagen per month.
Whoa!
So there's been a huge density problem for the city, And you also all of a sudden see that the opening of Sudhavn, which is opened up to actually a lot of development.
Right, the former harbor area has tons of new apartments down there.
And there's been some incredible developments there. Mainly also Aalborg University moved a campus there, and that kind of legitimized that area. And
right, TBC built their headquarters.
So what you referred to around First Friday and that whole Amager area was also that the commercial spaces pulled themselves out of the area.
Right.
It wasn't, I think, for business reason, it didn't work out.
Right.
So it went from being, I think, around 13, 14 partners to being 2 partners, us and Hotel Performer, which is an old historic
They're great. They're absolutely great.
Great place, and us, and that was strong in itself. But two partners didn't really
couldn't carry the whole thing.
Represent what the project was initiated to do, and I don't have a feeling that area has come back to that state ever since people started to move out.
Yeah. Well, at least not the street level face of it. There still is some, Niels Borch Jensen's down there. There's a lot of studios, a lot of musicians, a couple of film studios.
Absolutely.
There just isn't that public interface.
There's not the public access to viewing art.
Well, it's funny. I've been here for 10 years and I've seen it. Like I got here right when Valby was happening, which was another part, kind of a little bit outside of town, which had a building with a bunch of galleries in it. Which collapsed with the crisis, and I moved to Valby when I first came to Copenhagen. And we were like, oh, sick! There's like a whole building thing happening here, and then all of a sudden everything contracted. Yeah. Wow! It said it collapsed, went back down, and then in 2010 it started to kind of coming out again, and now it would
then kind of flourished from
exactly. And now it contracted again. I think we're maybe on the expansion side again, hopefully
in Valby.
Well, just in general. Again, that map you were talking about, that circumference is hopefully growing again. I mean, there's some galleries that opened out in Nordvest. That's helping kind of decentralize things a little bit.
Yeah, but that's what was going is that what I was just trying to say is that like the shift, the very quick shift in population that's happened in the city, and also the way we understand it, 68 was very much like caught in that float, and the nice thing is that somehow we ended up in center. And then that's when you open up the space. By the beginning, 2015 is like nice and fresh, painted and ready to go, right? But when you
14,
at the end of 2014, beginning 2015. But at that time, I don't remember. But did you bring some of the programming that we were supposed to have at Art Space, and they came over downtown?
Yeah. I think a lot of people will relate to 68 as a place where artists would have Duro shows, because that's mainly what I did most. Not in the very beginning of the program. Actually, the beginning of the program looks a bit more like the program is now, because in the beginning we invited, also artists to curate, and curators from abroad came from London to curate, and then some 68 productions, and then there was a period where it was more based on these Duro shows that I did. And that program continued when we moved to the city, until we then applied for the program that we are unfolding now, which is, again, some productions are made together with 68, and others are completely given over to external artists or curators.
I just wanted to quickly contextualize. When did you get involved, Hugo?
Well, it happened in a very nice and very magical way. I was kind of just minding my own business in Copenhagen, and I met Chris, and even at an opening here at the former Emo. It was Emo, right?
Yes, it was.
Which is out there, and they came to do a studio visit, and then they asked me to do a show. And this was around 2012. Yeah. So I just really liked what I understood very quickly what Iben was sort of focusing on, and what I did is I sort of I worked mainly with Chris on the exhibition because Iben was out of town. But what I did is I gave them a very, like, I would say high quality museum like show for the space. So I spent a lot of time on developing the pieces, the presentation, and worked with a Danish artist, Palle Nielsen, his historical, a very important artist from the Copenhagen art scene from the 60s. But what ended up happening was that the show looked I think it would look very good, and it was at the quality of the show that I wanted to give the space was in part with other exhibitions I had done outside in much more already established and professional places, because I could see very clearly that Iben had organized like a very, very clear program of bringing so many different elements from all over Europe and also from the Nordic region, and it was like you could see that there was a seed of something very interesting happening. So that's when I committed to the space, and I just kind of sort of by association I began to sort of follow them and support them in every which way. Every time they needed something for some discussion, some ideas, maybe propose somebody, etc. But then in 2015, and maybe this is the segue into the closing downs of all these spaces, there was there was kind of like a chaos, apocalyptic citywide level event in artist run spaces where the meteorite was coming, and what we're going to do to basically survive this extinction, right?
Yeah.
So we began having long workshops at my house, like really long workshops. And then Iben was like outlining all of her strategic vision for what she wanted to do,
but also, as you say, the concerns for the kinds of precarities that surrounds the economies for middle spaces.
Exactly.
Despite, of course, the great funding that we have in Denmark, it's still...
it doesn't mean you can relax.
No, exactly. Yeah. And of course, this reflects also this moment of a lot of spaces closing down. And I remember at the time, I had a lot of conversations with different people around, how can there be almost a desire to invest in something that gets lost? Because that's how I felt it, that there was a constant sort of, from different elements, a wish to support the startup, but only on a very sort of brief moment, and then all of the knowledge, all of the experience would drop over and over and over again. And that's also what we talked a lot about. How do you, in a place like Copenhagen, try to reframe in a way where you try to signal to the world that we need a stable structure, not a normative one, but a stable space that has a future and orientated towards future goals.
Right. A long-term vision.
Long-term.
Well, I guess a little contextualization is the right thing. What happened was the state, if I understand it correctly, the state announced the desire to invest in artist-run spaces. They did so for a number of years, and then they just pulled the rug out. They said, we're not doing this anymore.
I would characterize it more that you had already a very well-developed population of artists in the country. And they needed to very quickly, because we have this problem of jobs in arts in Scandinavia, the idea of creating the investment in the spaces was a way to kind of give all of these young artists that came out of school a postgraduate shot at actually socializing and connecting with each other and actually showing each other and kind of creating this this kind of like small incubation examples. And it was I would say, besides the fact that you had to go through a review to sort of get funding, like say when you applied for it, it was fairly democratic that the shot that everybody was able to apply for these and kind of come up with a grant for a concept in a space.
Right.
And so you got
like a pilot grant almost.
Yeah, it was a pilot grant. I mean, it was seed money, of course. It wasn't like this is the thing I want to clear up about Copenhagen money, is that there is money, but there also at the same time it's not like it's like flushed, where like a limo comes to pick up the artist and then take
champagne and crystal glass.
Exactly, yeah. No, it's I mean any artist that comes out of Minnesota or that lives in Minneapolis and sees how healthy some of the Minneapolis art scene is, and you're from LA and you're just like, what? You got money to run the space in the United States? That's crazy. So because you have a very nice government, or at least from the periods that I'm talking about before 2010. I don't know how it is now. But the thing is, here in Copenhagen, it was like, and also in other parts of Denmark, there's that the Arts Council has been looking as to how to support this. Now, in that process, of course, there were some grants to apply, but the identity of the project, and that's how I got involved, was to not just apply to become the same situation again. So they will be vulnerable again in 2 to 3 years again.
It's cycling.
It's a cycling.
Right. So it doesn't actually have any long-term kind of vision for how to support.
Exactly.
It's more just like, try it out and then we'll see what happens. And
and therefore you could sort of say that so many places closed down, and I would safely make the assumption, because I haven't spoken to every single space. I've spoken to half of them, but all of them came. At least I could say that if I could summarize their or abbreviate their thoughts, was that, okay, we really wanted to do this. We've learned the process. We like the process-based aspect of making art, helping out our peers, putting out work, but we don't want to be their gallerists.
Right.
We don't want to be the people that basically promote the next person under us or next to us or parallel to us.
Right.
Because the cohort is that I am an artist and I want to move too.
Right.
To like the same horizon that they're moving. And I'm seeing myself more as like an administrator.
And everybody's putting in crazy hours to get these projects off the ground. Mm-hmm. No one's making any money.
Exactly.
It's enough they have to use their own money perhaps to run the space, but no one's getting a wage. No one's getting anything for their time except for the experience.
And then that's where Iben comes in. That she really clearly saw this as like a way to create knowledge. And then the investment is, okay, if we're going to be spending this amount of time, we have to generate knowledge. And so I really, of course, I got very excited about that, because I felt that there was a very clear understanding of how to do this. Because that now, when we're talking about it, actually, that we're developing artistic and curatorial knowledge, then therefore we can actually create a development program, a cultural development program around that.
Perhaps knowledge, but also the word research has been one conception that we have used a lot recently in regards to the new program, because a lot of the projects are research propositions, and the way that the program has been composed is connected to people who has already invested a lot of time in their practice, in their work, individually defining a research proposition or a knowledge definition, but we've sort of tried to particularly invest in people who has put forward these propositions.
And how would you define a research proposition exactly?
Well, you've been looking through a couple of the books here. Of course, it varies from an artistic research and a curatorial research. It's not exactly the same, but of course, there's a lot of crossovers between the ways that artists and curators can work separately or together. But often the research has a center that the curator or the artist has been examining for a longer period. I'm going to maybe talk mostly about how it is for a curator, because that's most familiar to me. But in a kind of survey style, a curator would look at different practices that would form the research position. So let's say there's an artist working with a specific political concerns in contemporary culture. then a curator would start to look at that single practice, but also look at other practice to compare. How does artists diversify, nuance, and complex this particular questions that I saw in this one practice? So, and then from there's tons of methods for curators to compose research, and I cannot sit and say this is the methods used, because in that way it has the base from the historic position of artistic research, which has a non-academic way of not leading to knowledge or conclusions necessarily.
There's no dissertation, at least.
No, exactly. So that's why it's these definitions are always bounce back and forth, I think, within the art world, because they often conflict a little bit the potentials within art, but that doesn't mean that knowledge is not created. Of course, there's a lot of knowledge created. Of course, research propositions leads to a lot of artistic knowledge that curators or artists compose, and that's what I've been interested in trying to create platform for. But yeah, of course, it would be I think strange to. I think we have tried to create an open door policy to ask artists and curators what is artistic and curatorial research. What is it in Copenhagen? What is it when it's a small scale organization, platform, institute like ours? What does it mean when you take it to this scale, to this audience? Because it's also linked to production, it's linked to practice, and the things that was great about moving into a smaller space, because the space in Amager was actually much bigger, was that we could start producing exhibitions that were actually very different, because the concentration of the work became less and more concentrated, I think. The audience came closer, and maybe the audience felt a little bit more comfortable with the room, with the way that they were challenged by the exhibition. Yeah, exactly. And I think it helps for challenging propositions to have, or at least I think in 68's case, it's helped for us to not have a large-scale exhibition room with big works, with a lot of visual representation, but a more a different kind of logic for presenting and thinking around art.
Right. Which it sounds like you guys leave fairly open. It's not so much a matter of a personal, let's just say, curatorial vision. It's more of a platform, and using the platform to reach out to others and hear what they're doing.
That's a good way of describing it. The thing is that when we finished the workshops in the summer of 2015 to figure out where we were going to go with all this, the only outlet that we felt comfortable was to really refocus after this whole history of institutional critique, and actually really taking on the challenge of basically developing an institution. Because that was the organizational typology that we felt was the clearest structure in which we can broker both political and cultural support, and also like international interface, so we could be able to create this stage and this platform you're talking about, and then at the same time, kind of like get rid of some like 20th century practices in the space, in the white cube, let's call it. So we've kind of like sort of jettisoned the white cube, and we're focusing now on the actual politics of installation, or the politics of exchange, and the diplomacy that is occurring between an artist and a curator, which we are arguing that there is a knowledge that's also developing in co-creation between a curator and an artist, which is not acknowledged really, like say in the commercial blue chip art world.
Absolutely.
But I was just going to add that that a lot of this actually also came from moving into this room, because the the room itself, in a strange way, resists to a certain rationality, and we as artists and curators are somehow taught a very strict displaying, but also mounting practice that follows a lot of formal aspects and a lot of very, very detailed calculation that I felt was in a strange way really contrasting a lot of the critique or a lot of the different propositions that artists wants to position themselves in, critiquing modernity and all of these things, but we still somehow practice it. But then the room we have in Valkendorfsgade is so old. It's from 1732, which means the building has collapsed a bit to one side.
It's settled a bit.
It's settled a bit, and if you try to use calculation and measurement tools and what's it called?
There's no straight line.
Levels. Yeah. It doesn't work.
Right.
And I have to tell people when we work there, oh yeah, you can do that, but you have to use your eyes, and you have to look at what you're doing and how it relates. There. There's nothing straight, and it does something to, I believe, both to audience and to the people who come and work there.
Right, it's a protected building, right? There's rules about what you can do and can't do to the actual
Not so
space.
much inside. The facade is listed, and that one we can, of course, not touch, but inside we have the freedom to do mainly what we can do. It's more about the way the space is not a straight dimension, or doesn't correspond with your rationality.
Right.
It has its own life.
Yeah.
But that's very important. I mean, is that the thing is, this is one of the primary codes of art presentation that's established in the 20th century, and then the space basically really just resists that. I mean, if buildings could be called queer as structures, we have a queer building. So
you have a non-binary space.
Exactly. and so
who's getting politically correct now?
Exactly. and then at the same time we have a very interesting sort of setup that's developed out of this, which is in this program we've launched for these next 2 years. One of the things that we wanted to really think of is like, okay, what are the shows doing here to actually create bonds cross-institutionally with other institutes in the city or internationally? So when we discuss it with the curators coming in and the artists coming in many ways, we're trying to relieve their anxiety of having like a fully finished exhibition, because we're seeing these more as prototypes or as part of the research say an institute like the Caddis Foundation in Paris or somebody like that, or another institute in Denmark or in Norway. Somebody that's interested in what actually happened in that show and may end up inviting this artist and the curator or artist to actually take the same show into again and now fully develop it. But we're hoping that the research and all the beautiful things that actually sort of went into actually organizing this can somehow also be sustainable, in the sense that the idea wasn't just sort of flushed out in 1 month. And then that's it. We don't need to sort of see this. Thank you. And then this is also again part of the what I think is interesting about the intellectual aspect of designing a program, which is that it is about thinking of the the longevity and the sustainability of like what the exhibitions are, what are they aimed for,
right?
And so we really want to have this cross-institutional communication. And then, therefore, that's another way of creating diversity in the city, because not necessarily everything has to be new, but things have to be reconsidered, and then repositing a show in another area, in another space, could lead to actually really restructuring or correcting like misconceptions, both in research and also in the way that the art object is actually being constructed. As an artist, I see this as like tremendously useful, specifically in a process-oriented sort of, or a post-medium specific environment, where everybody's working with a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
So and because we have such a de-skilled way of working today, this kind of allows us to reconsider like where the skill and concentration is going to be higher to actually finalize an object.
It makes a lot of sense. And I really want, like, while you were just saying that, the thing that popped into my mind is that you were doing a huge service for the individual artist by focusing upon these connections and networks and transfer of knowledge, because it is often the case, especially in a world as pressured as the art world, where everybody's kind of has to worry about their own ass first. Where's the next job coming from? Where am I going to do this? That often these collaborations do just dissipate afterwards. You may be able to call them in the future, but whatever was created during that union can often just dissolve and disappear. And that's the fear an artist might have too. If this doesn't go somewhere, what am I going to do? What's going to happen next, etc.
Yeah. And I mean, we brought, for example, a researcher from Mexico City that wanted to talk about emotional communities. She was incidentally plugged into the space because of all the research we got going. But after she made her whole presentation about what these are, it became very obvious that like organizing shows once a month on an ongoing basis is you're developing this instantaneous emotional communities around ideas.
Right.
And each time you could see it more and more as to the level of delicate investment each of the curators and the artists basically give to it. So, of course, as an artist, I can't say as a curator, I can't fall into this category, even though I have curated for a while. But as an artist, I would say that one of the very few rewards you get, because it's kind of like the euphoria that you feel that people are falling into, like that they're successfully achieving some of the things that they want. And since these are not my objects, this is not my artwork, but rather it's just a community that's like basically producing their ideas and trying to sort of like model them in this very small space. We're hoping that they're getting like something out of it, which is actually some sense of movement outside of this stagnation, which is kind of like the overall problem in all of Europe right now, in terms of moving forward. And I suppose.
Mm. But I also think because in a sense we do, of course, the program sort of varies, and we have curators and artists of different ages, but there is maybe a little bit tendency that it's younger people that we work with. And I think it's also a nice challenge to your practice to be in exactly this intellectual collaboration community for a while, for someone else to interpret, have conversation around your practice, and vice versa, because it's definitely fruitful for curators, because in a sense the artist can always help the curator to nuance the proposition, because some curators doesn't take a very thematic or narrative kind of overlay. Others do. That can vary, but that exchange, I believe that there is a potential for both people to develop a new knowledge position, actually, from the conversation, from shared research that goes into that specific production. And we have never actually done solo presentations at 68, because I always felt that there was a lot of platforms in the city for the solo presentation. And I think it's great for an artist to have a solo presentation. I think it's important, and it does something very specific for the artist's career. But the group show, or the duo show, or the model where your practice is situated amongst your peers is also important. And it's also important that both artists and curators open up to each other's critiques, so that essentially by the end of the production, people feel like they have a better idea of the material that they are working with or researching.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things I thought about a lot after I went down and met you and is the idea about this research, because I think the word research in the arts is a abused word often. Mm. A lot of people talk about research with a very undefined idea what that is. And instead, Hugo, you were telling me more about the long-term plans, and the as far as I understood it, you guys actually had some certain specific goals you were working towards through research. And what I compared that to other times I've heard the word research, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody, at least personally, say we're working towards solving this or getting here or answering this, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the things which very much attracted me to what you do, is the idea that you kind of have a little bit more focus. When research is not just a word that's bandied about, it's an actual practice.
I'm going to try to attempt in your podcast to, like, once and for all, like, put this to rest.
Yes, let's do this.
And then your podcast could somehow, like, puncture into the universe. But this is the thing I find so mystical about the way people use the word research, because really it just comes down to research is a methodology. It's one of the tools kids in an artist's overall sort of way of practice. And so, even in the curators, and then what we're seeing, even and I've been spending in this mini think tank that she and I have going, is that we are influencing each other. And rather than me holding on to my position as an artist, like the sole creator, I realize like how creative Iben is, and like how her research ideas are actually influencing my way of thinking. And so I can't solely just sort of go into this like independent position and say, oh, my autonomy is actually not being influenced. I am actually sort of like the sole holder.
The other way around.
Etc. And the other way around, of course, but I'm using myself as a model and explaining that basically like what's happening is that in the exploration, which is what we mean by research in the old sense of the word, in the arts, is that we're sort of finding out exactly what is it that we actually are trying to achieve within the subjects or objects that we're seeking to make. So in this methodology that we're trying to say is like, okay, what are the products that come out of that? Like, what do we want to have in, say, 10 years from now? What do we want to see in terms of like not being an existential threat, for example, to the galleries? We want to support the galleries in the city. We want to support research products that will actually make it very clear to politicians that we're not just about gentrifying areas of the city. We're not about basically sort of trying to brand the neoliberal city so everybody's sort of like happy saying, oh, this is great what they're doing in Copenhagen. We're actually trying to sort of tap into the existing ecology of art that's sort of maintaining the relevance of art, but we're trying to sort of give it access to today. Like, what is the contemporaneity of the project? It has to do with that we're trying to clean up the relations. And second of all, we're not trying to create socialistic experiments in the gallery just so we could just have good pictures that could say, hey, people come to our events. But that actually that the people actually experiencing this will sort of open up to a new way of sort of saying, you know what, these people are investing in memory. Like how is this memory presented is not just discursive and it's not just immersive. It's also holographic. Like, in other words, like we would like people to kind of come into the hologram that is 68 and then sort of walk out of there with like the various tools we're trying to just provide society in that sense. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and also I think the way that the program actually diversify in the way that research is understood. You can see examples of it here from a curatorial collective in London, from content working in a very specific narrative. Curatorial proposition around narratives, to an individual curator here, to artist propositions. Like, I think the danger sometimes within this fairly new discourse of curating, it's only an academic structure from the 90s. It's only been written up in books since 80s. Of course, the practice is older, but sort of the formalization of curatorial practice is fairly new. And I think sometimes the danger of it is that there can be such a wish to really define your positions within it.
To brand almost.
To brand it almost, yes. And there's a market also for the knowledge that is created around it. But I am in a different way, more interested in actually trying to dissolve a little bit the big kind of juncture between artist and curator, and say, why don't we dissolve that dual constellation just a little bit to open up the potentials? Because of course there's been these very important and interesting essays written about how curators overtake or work without. There's one called Art Without Artists and so forth. Important writings, but it also in some sense maybe help to stimulate these more fragmented productions, which I think we should try and figure out a better way to work with the potential I believe is actually there. And whether it's the artist initiating the concept, inviting the curator in later, or the other way around, it's not so important. I think it's more what I wish for the space to examine, I would say.
Yeah. And just some practical things in terms of like these goals that we have, then that's where the Institute comes out of. So we publicly announced it, that we were changing the name from 68 Art Space to 68 Art Institute. And we generated a press release, which we thought it was just a press release, but some people are coming back to us saying that it's a manifesto. So we naively by default constructed a press release that entered this other realm. And
that's a good press release.
I think,
but it did entail strong language, not strong, but at least like
it was clearer.
Trying to tackle and speak out some of the positions that we thought needed a rethink.
Right. And we've been developing an organizational structure that we want to invest on long term. Like, we form an advisory board with really great people. As an advisor, I'm kind of acting like as an interim director of development, or if you want to think about that, or a person that's assisting with the strategic vision of the place. But the Iben is very much the director of the entire project, and so by this I mean is that we internally with Chris also acting as both like a curator and also like a editor in chief of communication and also writing and stuff. And it's just we are very much focused on sort of developing the positions where I as an artist that's making this time investment. Whenever Iben wants to step down, we can hand over a very healthy, very strong entity over to the next director for
and
whatever.
The next generation as well.
Exactly.
I think it's important that it's not about creating a space for one generation or for one peer group.
Right.
Well, as these spaces often do, they last for a while. Someone has the impetus to start it, and then they tend to close.
Yeah, I think it's nice to think, and with the name Institute, to think of 68 as a thing that is passed on by generation and generation,
which has a structure of its own.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I'm curious of before we wrap it up is also kind of the nuts and bolts, how the actual collaborations come about. If you guys are soliciting proposals, if you guys are working through your own network and knowledge of everything out there, how exactly does the practical side of it work?
If I can say, I think there's two levels of it, because I think what happened when we started to use the word research, a lot of artists actually came to 68 with research propositions. Of course, I think every space always get proposals sent. It's normal practice. A lot of artists do it, and they come from China or from all over, and sometimes they feel a bit detached, but a lot of other proposals or just emails saying, I read that you are beginning to work more in this research-oriented way. My practice functions like this. I feel there's something there. And then we would have different conversations with people. And this has, in some cases, also led to programming outside of 68. So, for example, I'm working with a proposal for Rundetårnet, which is kind of our neighbor, one of our institutional neighbors, which is going very well, and they're very positive about it, with an artist called Helene Nyman. And she just sort of, because of her practice being research-based, she just sort of picked it up. So that's one thing. And then, of course, the program is composed as a combination of people you read about, people you've seen shows of. The show we have up now is curated by Mette Kjærsgaard, a Danish curator, but she's been London-based. And I didn't personally know her, but I saw some of her shows in London. I thought she is a good candidate for representing what a Danish curator, educated abroad, can bring to diversify the idea of what curating is, for example.
We need that, yeah.
And that's actually what I felt like a lot of the propositions are about. Some people I know, of course, from different constellations of conversation, because network is also about exchanging knowledge, positions, and so forth. But it has been very important for me to not put together a program that favor a specific style, if one could say, a specific sort of
your personal filter.
Yeah, or it had to diversify, and I also thought it was important to invite, for example, Anja Franke. We have invited her into the program, an established artist and curator here, who's been for many years really also diversifying what artistic propositions and research can be about. So I think and together with you, Hugo, we just really looked for people who has defined things in ways that we thought were interesting in
it's
relation
your own
to
research.
How we wanted the institute to develop, basically, because they come with something to us. We give something to them. They come with something to us, but they also shape the way that we can think about the future for this place. So I think we've been sensitive towards selecting people who has bravely taken those independent positions as curators and as artists, because we're also working with an artistic collective.
Yes. Camel Collective, who one of Carla Herrera Prats. She's one of the people that is one of the main people that started Soma in Mexico City, she's based out of Brooklyn with and so they're kind of both between Mexico City and New York, and Camel Collective has been doing quite a lot of very interesting projects, and then also
artistic project that starts to also have a similarity with the curatorial methodologies. Or
exactly.
Like it's interesting to also present again these nuances of how can these positions shape one another, and how do they change from one position to the other, which I think Camel Collective is also a good example of.
Yeah, and then I mean the books that I gave you here, for example, Joel, we're really looking forward to his show, as we're looking up to next month's show, which is Juicy Cotella. He's not only a member of our advisory board, he was also someone that has been developing a project that is very clearly rooted in curatorial research. He's been taking it to different institutions, and each chapter that he considers them, he's been developing into the next.
And Jussi was educated an artist, has an artist practice as well, and did curatorial later. Like, these positions are...
It's starting to dissolve these boundaries, these kind of, towers.
Yeah,
these separate.
But in practice and in production for the good of it, rather than it being this power positioning question, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've done an hour. Wow. I could go on forever, I think is the impetus, but I think we're just going to have to say that we're just going to have to do another one in a year or two and hear how it's going, because there's so much to talk about. And I think what you guys are doing, what I appreciate so much about what you guys are doing is you have an on the ground approach to it. Whereas a lot of kind of more formalized and theorized projects, their feet don't touch the ground as often, and that's where I can kind of lose interest in it, because I want to see actual hands-on, finished, materialized things.
It's exhibition making.
Exactly.
Exhibition making is about research and knowledge in all kinds of ways, but it's a practice of exhibition making, which I think is also a healthy debate within the curatorial, maybe a little bit more when curatorial also steps into museology and actually more theoretical positions that it can, in dangerous ways, forget about practice.
Absolutely.
So I agree very much with what you're saying.
I have a question for you. I mean, one of our challenges is that we want to develop a very of course, like any institute, we want an engaged audience. We want people to come in and want to basically feel welcome, and that we created an aesthetic of hospitality that is in proportion to how they're understanding art today. And so, like someone like you that is not only trying to develop a program like this, but also is sort of interested in what's going on in the art. Like, what's your experience of coming to 68? Because I mean, of course, you came to see the space, but you met me. But I think it's very important how you, through your own experience, view what we're doing, because that's actually, we could be in the room like working on how to basically do this, but if we cannot have like a social contract with you to get you interested to come in, that's what's actually happening with everybody else.
Right. Well, I think I'm actually probably a fairly good example, because I kind of very strongly have my foot in both worlds. I'm an armchair intellectual. I don't read a lot of articles and essays and stuff. I don't engage so much with kind of a greater arts discourse. However, I am a practicing artist, and I try as much as possible. I just, for whatever reason, the way my brain is wired, I have a hard time with chewing through a dense article. So I have the desire, but some limitations, personal limitations. So my personal stepping stone is usually reaching out, where I say, I've heard a lot about what you do. I haven't actually been able to do all that much research. And what I found was you guys were very responsive. So that for me is the first thing, where I just say, hey, I'm here. Which then brought me into this space. Now, someone who comes from outside, if I just walked into the space first without introducing myself, I may have been a little put off, mostly because of essentially intellectual laziness. That I didn't have some sort of, it all would depend on the show, but I'm still kind of a little more conservative on the show by show level. And so I need to have the discussion we're having right now to engage, because now I'm super engaged, but I may not have had a point of entry for engagement. And so that is where the fall off would be. Where's the entry point for the discussion? Because as soon as we start talking about it, it makes a world of sense to me, and I'm all of a sudden super excited. But where's the entry point? And for me, with a lot of my engagement with the arts, this show is actually the entry point. But if I hadn't personally taken the impetus to do this, where would my entry point be? So I think that's one thing to think a lot about when workshopping it, is like, how do you get the person to ask you a question?
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and we've also developed a discursive layer of programming, public program, where we try to do talks that are less. Of course, there's some sort of presentation or beginning to it, but we value very much trying to create a more open dialogue. And what I have experienced a lot from being in other places, for example, in England, there's a much more people very upfrontly just engage in the discussions that are hosted at galleries or art museums or wherever. There's always like lots of waving hands to say something, to engage with the exciting speakers that are on. Where I felt sometimes also being a moderator here in Copenhagen, trying to invite other speakers in, that sometimes it takes longer time for the audience to open up.
There's a cultural thing about that.
Yeah, and that's also totally okay. And again, I would say that hopefully that the intimacy that the talks at 68 have, because it's not room for that many audience members at the time, but also we see it as this kind of slow process where we've done this public programming, and then we're seeing slowly how can we create a more maybe more intimate space for speaking and thinking around art.
There's no doubt that it's a hard proposition to your average person to come in, and it's not a hard proposition in that it's intellectually necessarily challenging. I sometimes worry that I will not be able to kind of follow some sort of discourse, but it makes perfect sense to me, everything we've talked about today. But I mean, one interesting idea would be to do kind of more cross-disciplinary, like my wife works in interaction design, and that is in her field pretty much an educational and technological question. But I mean, their whole thing is, how do you engage with a public? If you're going to build an app, if they decide within 10 seconds it's garbage, you're going to lose over half your users right away, and those kind of questions, that kind of interdisciplinary reaching may help a platform like yours.
Absolutely. But actually, we have taken some cautious decisions not to actually have such a rapid and what could you say, overexposed digital life. We do Facebook and the website, but they only output because I would like to insist that people also engage with the exhibitions, also the way that the space for its physicality can be documented, can be seen. It's nice if people see some documentation that are fragments of it, but actually come to see the show. And but I hear what you're saying with the interdisciplinarity that I think is super, super exciting. Also, when we think about not seeing an art institute like 68 or any other as only for artists. A lot of designers are working very critically with representation and architects and others. So I'm not so afraid of that, and to some extent, some of the programming has also had these more interdisciplinary invitations, especially the public program.
I like the way you bring up this question, like how you ask the question, and I mean, natural history museums right now all over the world are trying to take back the museums for adults away from children. So and so it in a way that gets sort of like a new generation of adults interested in their spaces. Simultaneously, yes, I mean, we are a very small scale operation right now in the city that's just beginning to sort of develop. But simultaneously, I think that the way you've described yourself is very important to understand that we are not trying to sort of create a narrow exclusivity around the productions in the space. Mm-hmm. So we welcome, if you feel very engaged now, we welcome maybe like your listeners or other people that are connected to you emotionally on the same level to actually want to also experience the thing. The thing is that we're not trying to sort of convince people about the value. We want them to want the value of it.
I think that's a very good point. So, and also the way it also dissimulate by itself. I think sometimes, like, I'm not saying that we are not dissimulating. We're doing a lot of work to present the text and the knowledge and everything around it, but it does also dissimulate itself. Yeah. And that's because of journalists and art critics writing about it, or simply artists telling the world about the productions they're doing. Plus, we also get invitations or propositions where there's these art tours that are actually for a much older or elderly audience that comes around. Yeah. It's fantastic.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of elements in it, like you mentioned about the National History Museums. These are questions that many, many institutions and cultural forces are dealing with, how to engage with the audience. And I have badgered the listeners of this show again and again and again through my own example that you're going to get as much as you put into it. So as long as you just even begin the process of engaging, you will find a world of information and people who want to engage back with you. And then it's okay to come from a different point of view. Artists are getting to the point now where certain tracks are they're trying to break down these walls anyway. So you coming from outside and not having a knowledge beforehand or even just a vocabulary about art can be to everybody's advantage. It doesn't matter if you've been art school trained. I have some of the vocabulary. I have some of the general concepts, but it doesn't really matter. It's okay to ask questions from a naive point of view, et cetera, et cetera.
Plus, exhibition practice as visual output, that's one of the great potentials within art. You can view it without reading it and be stimulated from that, and you can do both. It's you can exclude one part of it, but
there's many different levels to engage with, and you'll naturally be drawn more to some rather than others, and that's. Literally like I said before, part of my practice as a human being interested in arts is making a podcast. And it's enriched my life incredibly and my own practice because I ask questions. I engage on this level, but it doesn't have to be something of this level. You can just go and show up and talk to people. That's literally all you need to do. Yes, and ask nice. Questions. Yes. If you don't understand, ask. Because there is probably an answer. Yeah.
If you're curious.
Well, that's got to be the best place to leave it at this. Thank you guys so much for your time.
So much, Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Undergang Armchair. The intro and outro music is kindly provided by Johnny Ripper, and today's interstitial music was provided by David Hyde. You can find links to their music and tons of other conversations with great people on our research platform of a website, undergang.net. If you like this show, we would appreciate it if you take the time to leave a review on iTunes so others can find us. This show is produced in part with the kind support of the Danish Arts Council. Thank you so much for joining us.